Hello, this is Ruslan Belov once again, and this is the daily analysis of the Ukrainian front. So friends, let us begin today's review the same way as yesterday. From the south. Because just yesterday, in my report, I told you that there was some progress in the Zaporizhzhia region, and now footage has arrived confirming this, at least partially confirming it. You see here, the third micro-district consisting of multi-story buildings has completely come under Russian control. In reality, though, the situation is even better, because as I mentioned yesterday, there was also an advance further east of the third micro-district. And the fact that this micro-district was taken under control is also a major success, since it consists entirely of apartment blocks, which means it is a solid strongpoint. As for the main part of the settlement, Russian forces have not entered yet. The fighting there is mainly carried out by drones, aircraft, and artillery. Stepnohursk is a tough nut to crack, and for that reason its capture is extremely important, because it opens the road for 9 kilometers all the way to Veselyanka. Regarding the neighboring village of Plavny, there has been no progress there so far. Moving on, around Orikhiv it is quiet. There was a recent flare-up and push toward Novodanilivka, if you remember, but it looks like that was a one-time action, since no further activity has been seen. They failed to take Novodanilivka on the run, and they have not tried again. The same goes for Mala Tokmachka. The assault began, but again there was no progress, and now everything there has gone quiet. The same applies to Huliaipol. Everyone is holding their positions. Most likely, they will stay like this until the Vostok grouping further north reaches Pokrovska and cuts the main supply artery of the city from the north. So, until that moment, I do not expect any activation here. At the same time, the fight against first-person view drones is going on at full scale. Friends, a small request before we continue. If you like this video, please support the channel with a subscription, a like, and write in the comments where you are watching us from and what you think about what has been described. And now we continue. As for the area of responsibility of the Vostok grouping, namely Dnipropetrovsk region, the fighting has bogged down somewhat around Sosnivka. The armed forces of Ukraine are putting up stubborn resistance because they know that beyond Sosnivka there is simply emptiness. They would have to retreat immediately for 8 kilometers, all the way to Alexeyevka. And in fact, they would not be able to hold Alexeyevka either, since the village is rather small. That is why they are clinging so desperately to Sosnivka. Still, I think this issue will be resolved, and of course not in favor of the armed forces of Ukraine. And just before recording this video, we received reports that Sosnivka has completely come under the control of the Russian army. Footage of the battles and the Russian army establishing control has also been published. Ukrainian military experts themselves say that residents have begun leaving Pokrovsk en masse, as they realize it is only a matter of time before the war reaches their town. And overall, once the army reaches Arestopol or Velikomykhailivka, first-person view drones will easily reach the settlement and carry out constant strikes. That is why the residents are leaving this town. For now, it is a lull in terms of progress. But this is the calm before the storm. Moving on. As I mentioned yesterday, fighters managed to enter Moravka, into the eastern part of the village, and also cleared the area to the south. Fighting for Moravka will not be easy, but if successful, it will open the road to the northern part of Novopavlivka. There was also an unexpected success for the Russian army in the Dobropilya sector, with an advance at the base of the salient. That is exactly what was needed to widen the base of the breakthrough. Yes, the advance was not large, only 800 meters, but still the base of the salient has become 800 meters thicker. In fact, they managed to enter the eastern part of Novoishakovo and establish positions there. It would of course be good if they managed to capture both Novoishakovo, Ivanivka, and Volne. Then the salient itself would become much more secure. On the eastern flank, however, there are no changes. Fighting continues in Volodymyrivka and on the approaches to Shakovo. No strategic breakthrough has occurred yet. It will only happen when the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine is broken and Shakovo is brought under control. In the Kostyantinivka sector, the armed forces of Ukraine claim that they expelled Russian troops from Katerinivka. That is not accurate. Yes, they did manage to organize a counterattack and slightly push back Russian forces in the northern part of the village. Although it is not shown on this map, indeed there is currently no full 100% Russian control of Kateryniivka. But they have not been expelled from the village either. Overall, it feels like the Kostiantynivka front has stalled, since advances here have become very rare. But the Lyman sector has not stalled. On the contrary, successes are being achieved there. In particular, there was significant progress in Zarechny, despite the fact that the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine had recently reported that they expelled Russian forces from there. But did they expel them? On the contrary, Russian troops advanced by 1 kilometer 700 meters through the residential area, and at this point, most of the village is under Russian control. And as I have explained many times, Zarechny is essentially the key to Lyman. In Sumy region, on the border, the armed forces of Ukraine continue counterattacks on the southern outskirts of Yunakivka. It is quite difficult to hold Russian positions, but Russian soldiers are managing. There were also attempted attacks near the villages of Andriivka and Alexeyevka. In Kupiansk, the city council building has come under Russian control. According to local reports, the armed forces of Ukraine are retreating from the northern part of the city, leaving the district under Russian control. Their garrison is rapidly shrinking. They are trying to somehow restructure their defense, but it is not working. The situation for them is tense, difficult, catastrophic, I would even say. The advance of the Russian armed forces in the northwest makes holding the eastern bank of the Oskil River impossible. Ukrainian troops are retreating to the center, and further south, reports now say about 50% of the city is under Russian control. Some sources say Russian troops have already been spotted in the south, on the outskirts of Kupiansk-Uzlovyi. A few more points. In the Krasny-Lyman direction, Russian troops managed to flank and encircle the garrison of the armed forces of Ukraine in the village of Shandryholov. At the moment, Ukrainian troops are trying to withdraw from the village, which may turn into a cauldron. Retreating under artillery and drone fire is very difficult. Russian forces are also developing their success northwest of Zarechny. In Zarechny itself, which is currently divided roughly in half, fighting continues along Centralna Street. At the same time, the armed forces of Ukraine are pulling forces out of the village, while Russian troops are pressing south of Zarechny. Capturing this village would provide direct access to Krasny-Lyman. By the way, less than 7 kilometers remain to reach it, and between the Russian troops advancing on Krasny-Lyman, there is only a forested area left. Yes, it is a serious obstacle, but it is not another settlement. Ukrainian sources are worried that Russia might strike from Dronivka and Platonivka, which would hit the logistics of Siversk. That raises the threat of a blockade of this city as well. From the Chasiv Yar area, good news is coming in. Russian troops have been spotted south of the settlement of Predtekine, and part of this large pocket is coming under Russian control. So the success there will have far-reaching consequences. Well, that is basically everything on the front. As I said, there has been no major advance further, up the line. For now, we can say that there is a kind of lull, since there have been no big, loud breakthroughs for several days, the kind we became used to during the summer campaign. Nevertheless, we must remember that every meter gained is not just for nothing. Ukrainian forces remain very strong. They recruit 20,000 soldiers every month. A strategic turning point is still far away. But still, no matter what, Ukraine's strength is dwindling, and at this pace, they will not be able to hold the front for long. Now let us look at what is happening in the political arena. One United States ally has just carried out an attack on another United States ally, one that is covered by an American military base and American-supplied air defense systems. That is exactly how the Middle East perceived Israel's strike on the leadership of Hamas in the Qatari capital of Doha. And although the White House promises that such an incident will not happen again, the main thing is already done. The entire system of trust in United States guarantees in the Middle East has been undermined. On September 9th, Israel, using 10 strike aircraft, launched an attack on a building where members of Hamas were located. The building was not in Gaza, but in another sovereign state, one that is not officially at war with Israel. Israel has already killed its enemies through strikes on the territories of Lebanon, Syria, and even Iran. And it sees nothing illegal in doing so. We operate across the entire Middle East. Hamas will have no place to hide from us. Wherever we find them, Whether high-ranking or ordinary figures, we strike them. All of them, everywhere and always, said the Chief of Staff of Israel, Eyal Zamir, at the beginning of September. But this time, the victim was Qatar, a country that is one of the key allies of the United States in the Middle East. Moreover, a country that, relying on the honest word of the Americans and Israelis, invited a Hamas delegation to discuss the American initiative for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Qatar provided certain security guarantees as the host of the meeting, but it mostly relied on guarantees from the United States and Israel. If there had been no guarantees from them, Doha would have refused to provide a platform for negotiations and would have asked the Hamas leadership to leave the country, explained Middle East expert Kirill Semenov to the Vzгляд newspaper. Washington and Tel Aviv had assured their Qatari allies that no actions against Hamas would take place on their territory. The Americans immediately denied involvement in the strike. "This decision was made by Prime Minister Netanyahu, not me," said Donald Trump. He hastened to assure that this would not happen again. The Israelis confirmed that it was them, and only them. Israel initiated this, Israel carried it out, and Israel bears full responsibility, said Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Tel Aviv accuses Doha of harboring terrorists, financing Hamas, and providing its leaders with mansions. Trump said that as soon as he received information about the upcoming strike, he immediately asked the special envoy for the Middle East, Stephen Witkoff, to pass it on to the Qataris. However, Witkoff informed them only a few minutes before the bombing. Yet this version seems doubtful. According to the Qataris, they received the information not before the strike, but right as the explosions were already sounding. Military experts argue that without American approval, no such strike could have happened. The skies over Qatar are protected by American Patriot air defense systems, which did not open fire. The fact remains that Qatar's air defenses could not counter the Israeli strike. From a political perspective, Trump's motive for approving this strike was either to intimidate Hamas or to put Qatar's allies in their place, since they had begun pursuing an overly independent policy. For example, they refused to participate in the American-Israeli war against Iran and hosted politically untouchable groups on their soil. Perhaps Israel and the United States wanted Qatar to lose its status as the Mecca of the oppressed. They wanted it to no longer provide refuge to various political forces disliked by many, says Kirill Semenov. Nominally, the operation ended unsuccessfully. The son of the delegation head was killed, along with several of his staff and one Qatari security officer. But the delegation members themselves were not harmed. According to unconfirmed reports, at the moment of the strike, they had gone to another room to pray, leaving their phones in the room that Israeli bombs had targeted. Nevertheless, a major crisis has erupted in American-Qatari relations. The entire region must respond to such barbaric actions, declared Qatar's Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani. And his anger is understandable. For Qatar, this is an extremely serious challenge. It can no longer consider itself a safe state, says Kirill Semenov. It is important here to understand the Qatari mentality. In the 1990s, this small but very wealthy state feared sharing the fate of another small but wealthy state, Kuwait, which was effortlessly invaded by a large and powerful Iraq. When Emir Hamad came to power in 1995, he relied on several elements of protection. First, on the Americans. In 1996, the Emir built the Al Udeid air base in the country for $1 billion, which became one of the largest American bases in the region. Second, on Al Jazeera, which, thanks to big money and buying the Middle Eastern bureau of a well-known Western channel, turned into the most influential Arab media outlet. And third, on diplomacy. The Qataris offered their mediation in the Arab-Israeli, Arab-Iranian, American-Iranian, Afghan, and many other conflicts. Mediation, and accordingly, a platform for negotiations and security guarantees. Now, with one strike, Israel has destroyed this entire security system. American planes did nothing to protect the country's airspace, and Tel Aviv can repeat such a strike at any moment. The Israelis kept moving the red line further and further, and now nothing is left of it, said Kirill Semenov. Of course, the Israeli leadership will not bother to draw it again. The long arm of Israel will strike its enemies everywhere. They will have nowhere to hide, threatened Israel's defense minister Yisrael Katz, Now Israel demands yet another public humiliation from Qatar to expel all Hamas members from its territory. I say to Qatar and to all countries harboring terrorists, expel them or bring them to justice. Otherwise we will do it ourselves, said Netanyahu. Even if Qatar refuses, there is no longer any neutral and safe platform in the country after Israel's strike. Yes, one can argue endlessly that Qatar's responsibility in what happened was minimal. But what matters is not what was, but how it looks. And the question now is not only what Qatar's leadership will do, its capabilities are limited, but how other regional allies of the United States will behave. Those who have received guarantees of American protection and do not want to be accused by their own populations of assisting Israeli strikes against their own sovereign states. It is very likely that they will begin searching for new allies and new suppliers of air defense systems. Yesterday's intrusion of a group of Russian drones into Polish airspace showed that NATO is far from eager to go to war with Russia. Overall, the official reaction was fairly restrained. Expressions of concern, consultations being held, and NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte even stated that the incident demonstrated NATO's ability to defend its air borders. That last claim is rather questionable, because when 24 unmanned aerial vehicles enter your airspace, you shoot down 3, and the rest are lost from radar. This hardly proves your ability to protect your skies. Moscow claims the appearance of Russian drones over Poland may have been unintentional and says it is ready to hold talks with Warsaw on the matter. Minsk asserts that the drones also flew over Belarus and were disoriented by electronic warfare systems. What really happened is unknown. There are many versions, from a Ukrainian provocation, recovering preserved geranium drones, restoring them and launching them toward Poland, to a Russian attempt to probe NATO's air defenses on its eastern flank. However, it is notable that during the drone incursion, air traffic at the Rzeszów airport, a key logistics hub for supplying the Ukrainian armed forces, was completely paralyzed. This allows one to suppose that if unidentified drones were to periodically fly over southeastern Poland, the Ukrainian army could begin to face problems with the delivery of weapons and ammunition. But these are purely hypothetical reflections. For now, both Warsaw and Moscow are behaving as though they do not intend to attach much importance to this incident.